message from our sponsor, the Royal Literary Fund.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves a chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the novelist Ben Okri.
We spoke to Ben about his early life in Nigeria and Britain, about winning the Booker Prize in 1991 for The Famished Road, and about his latest book, Madame Sosostris and the Festival for the Broken-Hearted.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, Ben. Welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the podcast. We wanted to start with the new book, Madame Sosostris and the Festival for the Broken-Hearted. So, Madame Sosostris is a character from The Wasteland, the legendary Eliot poem. Why were you drawn to that? And is it a kind of crossover with your own interest in poetry?
Well, first of all, Rachel and Simon, it's a real pleasure to be on your podcast and looking forward to our conversation very much. Well, Madame Sosostris is a figure that's been around in the human consciousness for a long time. T.S. Eliot got her from Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow. And Aldous, I think, borrowed her from two different sources. I think one was the influence and the presence of Madame Blavatsky, the theosophist, who kind of inseminated Britain and the West at that time with a tremendous spiritual influx. And the other, I think, is from ancient Egypt, from the Memphis cult. So she has a very long pedigree. I wanted, in the writing of this book, I wanted a character from literature to behave like a human being in life. It's just one of the tropes I was working with in this book, because it's about heartbreak, and it's about the times in which we live. It's about the undercurrent of wastelandish feelings and presences. And I just wanted to just look at the human condition from the view of heartbreak.
I enjoyed the fact her rider was business class tickets and a trip in a limo to attend the festival. What did she allow you to do in terms of her function in the plot?
She gave me kind of literary freedom, really, because she's a fictional character who I've made real, brought back to life, as it were. She kind of brought two worlds with her. Anyone who knows my work knows that I like working with two or three worlds at the same time. I think it's part of my kind of my poetic heritage, and also part of my African heritage. We're kind of like a 2-3 world people at the same time: the world of the living, the world of the dead, the world of living, the world of spirits. So I've always liked interfaces between worlds, the world of poetry, the world of prose. I love interfaces because it kind of gives me a nimbleness. And Madame Sosostris gave me the freedom to, as it were, I don't want to use the word be prophetic, but to sort of look into the human condition through the symbolism of the tarot. She was like a periscope in a way, a very indirect way of looking at this world. And then she brought the whole literary tradition with her. So she brought a tremendous force. And also in the book, she's not present as herself, or she is only once. And then she's present afterwards as a kind of avatar, as a kind of possession, inspiration, powerful by absence. So yeah, that gave me a lot of, because I wanted a text that was both light and dense. I wanted to be both vertical and horizontal. I wanted it to be very, very deceptive and nimble. And the tarot card is like that. The tarot card is a very nimble, very light, compressed, deceptive device of the human imagination.
And the This festival for the brokenhearted takes place in a chateau in the south of France on a midsummer night, and guests are in fancy dress. So there are sort of other touchstones you've got here, like the idea of the midsummer night, the idea of disguise. What was the appeal of those tropes for you to getting into them?
Well, Midsummer Night is famously one of those nights in legend and mythology, and in real life, that allows many realms to enter into our realm. It's been famous like that for centuries. It's a time of the year when other presences. Shakespeare was drawing upon that. Midsummer Night's Dream is a tale of, ostensibly it's about a marriage, but it's also about other worlds entering into this world. It's also about the world of fairies. It's a very famously fluid period in terms of human consciousness and myth. So that was perfectly my territory. That was just exactly the kind of energy that I wanted, literary energy that I wanted for this tale, where people are dissolving, their identities and personalities are dissolving, morphing out of themselves into things and beings they don't quite understand. Um, and as for the other trope, which was the other trope you mentioned?
Fancy dress.
And costume, same thing really. Identity again, personas. The fact that we are who we are because of how we present ourselves, our personas. And when you alter the persona, something is altered in who we are. I think it just gave me an opportunity to look at the fundamental instability of the idea of personality, um, which I think is one of the dangerous tropes of our times. That we think that the personality is a person. With all these big characters, we think that's who they actually really are, when in fact, behind them are other personas, other figures, and these secret personas have a tremendous influence on our times. It's a way of looking at the human being through the scope of a kind of archaeological layers within the self, layers within our psychological presences.
Given all these themes that you wanted to explore in the novel, what was your research process like, or did it come to you as a quite kind of fully formed idea?
Oh, it's extensive research, lifelong research, Rachel. You don't. I mean, a lot of it was already present in me, but a lot of it I had to do a lot of reading, because *Midsummer Night's Dream* is one of my favorite Shakespeare texts. But I had to do a lot of reading around it. I had to do a lot of reading into to see what the current literary as well as psychological, psychoanalytical research has been, and it's quite extensive. Had to do a lot of research into the tarot. Tarot has always been of personal interest to me. I've always loved and been fascinated by its symbolism. I'm not so greatly interested in its future reading aspect. I think that's the more common aspect of it. But as a psychological instrument, as an instrument for the imagination, it is extraordinary, and almost nothing like it in a history of civilization, and deadly in its economy. You know, to freight some of the highest wisdom of the race and the highest symbolism of the race into playing cards. Whoa, amazing. Um, so there was a lot of research had to be done in that, and a lot of stuff discarded. I did a lot of research and then threw the whole thing away and just dive into the risk of imagination.
So of late, you've been working a lot in areas outside the novel, so publishing poetry, short stories, children's fiction, and The Last Gift of the Master Artists was a novel, but that was a reworking of a previously published book. So what was it like to kind of get back into a completely new long-form fiction project?
Oh, very good question. The thing is, I really don't. I don't. Maybe there's something. Maybe there's a red or blue pill I need to take, but I don't really see that much of a fundamental difference between all these different forms. I move in and out of them, um, not simultaneously, but kind of like easily. Um, when I write poetry, I have to enter into a different frame of mind, a very concentrated, very very tough frame of mind. Prose is easygoing, rigorous. Yeah, I'm always writing fiction of one kind or another. It's just the way I am. It's just this one took a long time to marinate and to cook. Just took a long time to get the tone right and to get all the elements to just feel natural and easy. I really wanted something really easy going, on the surface, something playful, but quietly deadly. Apparently there's certain carpets that look normal. You touch them and they become spiders. It's a surface like that.
That's a particularly unpleasant image. um, across those different modes, is your type of approach or your method of writing the same? I saw that you write often really early in the morning, kind of 1, 2, 3 a.m., and that you use photos as kind of primers for characters and things like that. Is that the same process, whether you're writing a short story or a poem or a novel?
I only did that process of using photographs and paintings and stuff. I only did that for The Famished Road. That was just one book. Every book is different. There's some books I wrote standing up. There's some books that I write kind of lying down on the floor. There's some books I write sitting at a chair without a desk. Like there's some books that I write in tiny little notebooks. Every book is very different because it just demands a different thing from you. And I've found sitting at a desk to writing, after a while, it only gets to a certain part of my mind. So, I mean, that was a very intense period, the period of the photograph and paintings that you talked about, where I used to pin posters. I went hunting for images that would just help my imagination. That was extremely intense, and I couldn't really go back to that. Sometimes I draw because I have a secret life as an artist, and sometimes I try and draw. I endlessly draw characters. And the drawings sometimes actually help me get a grasp on them. So it changes, and even my writing process in terms of day. When I was much younger, I wrote at night. I'd be up all night, and work till about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning when people are getting up and going to work. Horrendous feeling to finish writing and to be trying to get to sleep, and you can hear your next door neighbor upstairs having a shower, going to work. You haven't slept yet. Yeah, that was and to do that for a number of years, the time it took to write The Famished Road. Well, as I got older and then I had a wonderful daughter, that had to change. She just changed all that. You couldn't write at night with a with a young baby cat. You'd go crazy. So now I have more sober habits.
We want to roll back in a moment to kind of your early life and all of that period, but you've been published by a lot of different houses. So the recent books were The Head of Zeus, you published poetry with Apollo, earlier novels with Weidenfeld and Nicholson, Jonathan Cape, Longman, right at the beginning of your career. What has led those shifts between different houses, different publishers?
Oh my God, what a lovely question, Simon. Just people. I mean, you've pulled out not a sore point, but just a sad, maybe even awkward element. It's just people. Like this. There's not much I can do about it. With the early novels, the Longman novels, I was really young. That was very. It was a publishing house that kind of specialized at that time in African fiction, and I wanted to get out of that. I didn't want to be in that ghetto at all. I wanted to be kind of like a regular publisher. But with each time, editors move. New editors come in and they don't quite like your style or like the kind of things you're writing about. They want things more set in England, and there's really not much you can do about that. Sometimes publishers just they don't get it, and you have to move on to people who do. I mean, I wish I had one house all along. I loved it. I really love the stability of a long career with just one house all of your life. It's just amazing. But that wasn't to be. I do have a very long and wonderful relationship with Head of Zeus now. They've published at least my last 8 books. I like that. I like stability.
Fair enough. Could we roll back now to your early life? You were an early reader and then a very voracious reader. Can you tell us a little bit about your early interest in literature and what you remember of it?
Yeah. No, Rachel, I think like a lot of people who become writers, I began reading very early. I think I surprised my mom. When at 4, I picked up my dad's copy of the Times and just began reading it. And that's still one of my earliest reading memories, apart from being at school and constantly raising my hand up and they were teaching poetry and English literature. Yeah, just reading Dad's copy of the Times and being shooed out of the room because visitors were coming, and my mom was embarrassed at the idea of her young son being seen reading. Yeah, and as far back as I can remember, from very early on, I was always reading poetry. My earliest reading was English poetry, English romantics. I was reading Keats. I was reading early versions of Lamb's tales of Shakespeare before I actually read Shakespeare himself. I came to novels later. Poetry, I remember, was my earliest reading. I got poetry really, really early.
And we saw that you used to raid embassy libraries in Nigeria. So from the US, Emerson and Whitman; from the Japanese, karate, Zen Buddhism, Basho. Tell us, about what that experience was like and what you took away from that kind of very diverse range of reading.
I had my dad's library, books that he brought back from England because he came here to study law, and went back with an excellent set of classics, which I discovered under a kind of a forbidden tone from my dad. I wasn't supposed to read them. He was supposed to read them. My job was to dust them. I discovered those and Ibsen and all of that, and read through those. And I just found I needed to get hold of books from around the world, and there was nowhere. I didn't know how to get hold of them. We didn't have very good libraries in Lagos back then. So I thought the embassies might be able to help. So I went to the American embassy, the USIS library, and I'm just astonished that they let you walk in and read books. And then I began to work my way through the other embassies, the French, the Japanese. The Japanese was the first one, actually, because of, exactly as you said, because of karate. I was bullied at school a lot. And I needed a tool. I needed something to help me even the playing field. And I learned karate. I was very small at school. I went to school very early, really, really early. So everybody else was much bigger than me. I was in class with people who had beards in early secondary school. Yeah, so karate led me to Basho, and that just began, and that gave me an early internationalism. I didn't know that I was gaining an early internationalism reading Basho and Whitman and Ibsen. I had no idea that I was actually reading my way through world literature. I was just discovering books from other places, and it's been a permanent part of my psychology of reading ever since. I really believe that we should be international in our reading, and it's one of the things I lament most about most of the cultures in the West that I visit. People tend to read too nationally, and sometimes they read too regionally. They read their own. They read their own people. They read the kind of people they went to university with. They don't read widely enough. They don't read the world. They don't read Africa. I think it's a great tragedy that it's not enough of the reading of places like Africa. They read Latin America now because of the fame of Marquez and Carlos Fuentes and people like that. But it's not enough genuine internationalism. And I think when there's a failure of internationalism in reading, it's not surprising that you have the kind of movements that's sort of hostile towards other people from other parts of the world. This anti-immigration, this some of the downsides of Brexit. It's just it comes from this not being interested enough in the world. So it's a vital part of my personal psychology and my personal reading. It shows in. I don't quote very much in my reading. I don't drop names. But if you can read beneath the surface of every sentence I write, it's kind of, and it's been enriched by just about every literary culture in the world.
Do you see that broadening of literary horizons, changing and improving? I saw a study recently that young people in particular are more voracious consumers of translated fiction. So do you see that as something that's improving over time or not really?
Translated fiction is good. Translated fiction has always been there, and I really love the fact that there's more of it. And from countries farther away from us, like Korea and Iceland, there's a lot of that. But what about the untranslated fiction that's in the English language that we're not taking enough interest in? Like I said, the great literature of Africa. And I think it's one of the reasons why I worked very hard on this Everyman anthology called African Stories that's just been published at the same time as Madame Sosostris and the Festival for the Brokenhearted. I wanted to put together classic stories from Africa because people will be astonished at the quality of really good writing and extraordinary stories from the continent. And this was just scratching the surface. 36 stories, 500 pages, and I had another 50 more, just as good, that could have filled the second volume. So I don't want to just be a kind of an evangelist for African literature. I just want people to read literature from everywhere because it's. I think part of the way in which a mind is imprisoned is by being locked in too much into its own culture, when we should be, as human beings, receptive to all the streams of the human imagination and human endeavor, the human spirit, the human courage from the smallest and the biggest nations.
Could you tell us now about your own route to publication? So we saw that you started writing for some local newspapers in Nigeria, moving from non-fiction about kind of social issues to some fiction. And then we touched on this earlier, but then getting your first book published with Longman when you were 19. Take us to that period.
Oh yeah, yes. I began writing with poetry. Because I began reading with poetry. It's very, very interesting how one's reading and one's writing kind of track one another. But the poems I wrote were numerous and actually really bad. It's it's as I began to read my way through the library of other nations that I realized that some of those love poems I was writing was just it's not enough to say you're in love. It really isn't. You have to find a secret language to express it and a meter. So that took a while. I wrote about 100 poems, and one day I had a revelation, went through all of them, burnt about 95 of them, kept 5. So if you want to ask about my writing, my real writing history, it began with the history of the burning of 95 poems. That was quite something. And it's sort of compressed into my mind the feeling that you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this again. So you better raise the level of your craft. And I began writing out of a sense of outrage at what was being done to the poor people on the edges of Lagos where we lived at the time, because my father's life had taken a bit of a drop. It had difficulties, and we had to move to the poor areas. And it was the first time I came in contact with the poor of my country, and just shocked at how they lived and how they were treated by landlords, and just felt outraged enough to write about it. And to my astonishment, it was published in an evening paper, one of those pieces, and I was very encouraged, and wrote many more about the water conditions, about the quality of water people drank, about the rooms and the filthy bathrooms and the bugs around. I wrote essays and essays for the newspapers, and none of them were published anymore, just that first one. And I thought, well, if they're not going to publish them as essays, maybe if I try to tell them as stories, maybe that might work. So then I began to write stories, half incorporating some of these conditions, and half just getting caught up in characters and plots. And these stories were published in women's magazines. They were the ones most receptive to publishing short stories at the time in Nigeria, and I'm eternally grateful to them. These haven't survived. No, I didn't keep copies. I did, yeah. So I've lost most of those. And then I began one of the short stories I was writing at the time, just kind of grew and grew. And a year later, I was still writing it, and it became a novel. It became my first novel, Flowers and Shadows. At the time, it was called Shadows and Shadows. And then I came to England because I wanted to study, and I arranged to get myself fired from my job, because if you were fired, you got paid. There's a kind of amount of money you got paid if you were sacked. If you resigned, you didn't get anything. So I got fired, and
How did you get fired? How do you
just,
get someone to fire you in a way that still ensures a payout?
you just behave badly. I just behaved badly. Turned up late for work. I'd be writing short stories when my supervisor would be coming by. He'd be saying, "What's that work you're doing there? This is not office work. What is that? You're writing stories in the office?" And that's what I did. I just got on their nerves. And I'm sorry if I came across as a horrible person, but I had to get fired. I needed that money. And with that money, I bought myself my first camera and my first typewriter. And that made all the difference, because it meant I could type out this novel that was called Shadows and Shadows. And those two things and a couple of trousers and shirts were the only things in my suitcase that I brought with me to England.
When you'd finished the manuscript for what became Flowers and Shadows, do you take it to an agent in the first instance, or do you go straight to publishers?
I had no idea there was such a thing called agents. I got this thing called Writers and Artists Yearbook, which I still recommend to all my friends, all the people I meet who want to write. They say, when they ask me, "What can I do?" I said, get the Writers and Artists Yearbook. It's a really terrific book. It lists agents, publishers, just everything you need. And I just got a list of publishers, and I sent them to all the publishers I could think of. I sent them to the best publishers I could find. I just kept sending, and I kept getting rejection slips, and I just kept sending, and sometimes writing the book, and a year or two went past. And then one day, I was living with my uncle in New Cross, and one day I got this letter. Never forget it. It's one of those moments that kind of forever ingrained, forever etched in your mind. Open this letter, "Dear Ben Okri, we have the pleasure to," and that was one of the most incredible moments. They'd accepted it. They loved it. They wanted me to come in and see them. And that was wonderful. Went in, the editor, a tall young man at the time, I remember the first question he asked me, "Who's your favorite writer?" And I came up with a list of very sort of classical names, as you would kind of expect. And I asked him, who was yours? And he said, Tolkien. I just remember little things like that. And then it was another 10 years before I read Tolkien.
It's a rule of the podcast we always ask about money. So do you recall with that first book how much the contract was worth?
Yeah, I think it was 300 quid. 300 pounds. My daughter would rap me on the fingers for saying quid. 300 pounds. You get, I think you got an advance of 150, and then you got 50 when the manuscript was accepted, and another 100 when it was published. But 300 pounds at the time seemed to me like 30,000 pounds. Really, to be paid for this book that I loved writing.
And you had a Nigerian government scholarship to study at the University of Essex, but the funding was withdrawn and you ended up homeless. But you said that this was both a very challenging time of your life, but also a formative one. And we found this particular point that you made about being outside a restaurant in Notting Hill, looking in and seeing people eating steaks and chicken and pasta. Tell us about that period and how you got yourself out of it as well.
Well, first of all, the scholarship wasn't withdrawn; it just disappeared. My investigation has led to surmises that it got entangled in corruption. It was a easy money to raid. I don't know. All I know is that it changed my life. I was at university one day, and the next day I was eventually out in the streets. I'd never had any experience of homelessness before. I did not even know that it existed. I wasn't home in my own in the country where I was born. I was in England, where I wanted to, where I wanted to be to sort of learn how to write. I always say I came to England because of Shakespeare and Dickens, and please, Jane Austen, and Emily Bronte. I came because of all these great books that I read when I was a kid here and when I went back to Nigeria. And then I found I didn't have money to pay rent, and then I was homeless. And homelessness was a practical thing. It was at night you simply had nowhere to go, so you looked for somewhere in the city where you could pass the night. And back then there were a couple of places. There were tube stations. They used to be open in those days. Now they're shut. You can't. That's not available to you as a homeless person now. Charing Cross Station was great. There's a whole group of us. All kinds of people just sleeping rough. People would run away from home, from Liverpool or from Scotland. I'd always had books. I had lots of books that I had with me at university. I had notebooks, so I read. I read some of my most important books at that time: Dostoevsky, House of the Dead, Karamazov. Read a lot of poetry. Frost, Baudelaire. Baudelaire was great to read. Homeless. Felt like a fellow traveler. And then in the morning, you find somewhere to wash your face, and then that's the daytime is not so difficult. There are pubs, there are libraries. There's a city. This is a great city, and in the daytime, there's plenty to do. There's museums. They're all free. As for food, I always found the food was difficult. Drinks was not. If you were a good conversationalist and you met people and you were chatting to them, people bought you drinks. Do you want another pint, Ben? Yes. Drinks, yes. Food, not so difficult. No one says, "Oh, great conversation. Would you like a steak, Ben?" No, nobody does that. So drinks, yes. Food, no. Didn't have an overcoat, so I was freezing. I don't know how I survived. I don't know how I didn't come down with pneumonia. Tube stations and banks, doorways of banks were great at the time because I always heated them for some reason.
How long was this period?
I've never really measured the time, but in my mind it seemed to go on forever. It could have been a couple of months. It could have been a month. It was long enough for me to do a lot of reading, and a lot of note taking, and to change from one kind of writer to another. Because I was at uni studying literature, I was a very over literary writer. Too many allusions. I'm tempted to say I was a pretentious writer, actually. And there was something about streets, tube stations, banks, looking at people eat, watching people go to work in the morning. That was my most profound observational relationship with life. Rilke talked about the time when he was a secretary to Rodin. And Rodin said, you know what you need, young man? You need to learn how to look. And sent him to the zoo to go look at animals. And he'd go to the zoo and just look and look. He learned to look. He learned to see. And that changed his writing. Well, I learned to look at human beings going to work in the morning, eating in the evening. I learned to watch people, watch society. And that changed me. That brought me back into the world. And then I began to write reviews. A friend loaned me a small amount of money. I got a room somewhere. The New Statesman gave me books to review, and I just clawed my way up. And I was writing novels and short stories. I was writing the same short story over and over and over. And eventually sent one out. It was published by Peter Ackroyd in a pen anthology. Really important moment. A short story called Disparities. And he referred to it in his introduction, and people just immediately took an interest in me. It was a strong story set in London, more or less about a homeless guy, not me, but yeah, that's how I began. It was as if I always say to people that homelessness was not a choice, but it was it became a vocational moment of transformation. My mother, when she heard about it, she came to see me just before I published The Famished Road. She came to England, and she just read these interviews where I've been homeless. And she when she heard about it, the first thing she did was she burst into tears. So she didn't know. My dad didn't know. I didn't tell them. I didn't think it was their business. I thought it was it was my thing, and I had to get myself out of it. It was my life. I was grown up. I was responsible for myself. I didn't feel I needed to go running to mom and dad, and I certainly didn't feel I needed to go on the dole and burden the country with my needs. I had to get myself out of it myself.
You can understand her reaction, at least.
Oh God, no, God, with my daughter, if I heard, God, this is almost about to make me burst into tears. If I heard that my daughter had gone through that and I didn't know about it, I'd be. Yeah, so now I can see the other side of it now. Absolutely, absolutely.
A message from our sponsor, Scrivener. Is your word processor holding you back? Are you constantly breaking your flow to search your computer for vital notes or research? If so, Scrivener can help.
Scrivener is a best-selling app tailor-made for writers, combining all the tools you'll need to craft your first draft. However you write, Scrivener molds to fit your style. Plan everything first or just get writing, and restructure later using the app's integrated outlining tools. Got a good idea but don't know where it fits? Write when inspiration strikes, then find its place later.
Rearrange your plot on virtual index cards in Scrivener's corkboard, or work with an overview of a chapter, a part, or even your whole manuscript using Scrivener's outliner. Break chapters into shorter, more manageable sections, and then edit them in isolation or as a whole.
In Scrivener, you'll find everything you need to get writing and keep writing. Find out why it's the favourite app of best-selling writers and aspiring authors alike by taking the 30-day free trial, or use the code TAKENOTES before 20th of June for a 20% discount on Scrivener for macOS or Windows at www.scrivener.com.
Can we talk now about another short story that kind of metastasized and turned into novel, The Famished Road? You talked as well about the process of doing that, but also the process of finding the right tone, and in particular, the right way to talk about time or describe time or have time take on a different quality in your novels. Can you kind of walk us through the evolution of that short story and how it became a novel?
Yeah, that was the strangest thing. I think people underestimate the short story form. The short story form is the most maybe outside the sonnet and some of those more difficult Japanese poetic forms. Not only is it the most rigorous, it's like those paper flowers that you get this big piece of paper and you compress it and you get this tiny little paper flower out of it. That's what the short story is like. And inside it is this enormous potential for expansion, which is held in by a tremendous force. It reminds me of certain processes of nuclear fission. And every now and again, I think writers hit upon a short story that has got so much potential inside it that if you were to find a way somehow to release that potential, you have no idea where it will go. And I said to people, many of the great novels of the world began as short stories. Ulysses began as a short story. I am not sure, but I think there's a rumor that Don Quixote began as a short story. But and I understand it, the relationship between this very small thing with tremendous compression and worlds inside it and this big form. There's a deep relationship. So one of these short stories, I began to write it. Then I was dissatisfied, and I rewrote it, and it got bigger. And I left it, and then came back to wrote it again, and it got bigger. And then one day it just no, not one day. Then I put it aside, and then I wrote a lot of short stories. My first two volumes, and it was in those volumes, because I was a very European kind of writer. That's how I learned to write, from Maupassant, Ibsen, and the Western classics. But one day I was thinking about something that my father had said to me. We're talking about philosophy, and I was arguing with him about philosophy because I was reading Plato a lot at the time. And I was having this argument with him about philosophy, about reality. And he stopped and he looked at me and he says, "But Ben, we have our philosophies too. We have our philosophy too." And he was talking of Africa, the Yoruba people. And I remember looking at him in astonishment, going, "Really? Oh, where can I read it?" And he said, "No, but it's here. It's here." And he indicated the air, the environment, the atmosphere. And I was thinking about that years later in London and what that meant. And I realized what he meant was that our philosophy permeates the world. And that was a turning point. I suddenly realized that the technique of Dickens and Jane Austen, wonderful, extraordinary though they are, actually don't work for conveying. If you want to convey some mysterious element of the Nigerian or the African world with all of our all of our beliefs impinging on reality, all of the ways in which our superstitions and our ways of thinking, our proverbs, actually were a part of reality. To catch that, you needed another tone, you needed another voice, another beat, and I just gave me. I needed a long time to create that. The short stories gave me that, and then when I came back to this expanding thing, I'd found the tone that I needed. And that began my long experimentation with tone, even when I was not writing about Africa, tone and voice.
So the Famished Road won the Booker Prize in 1991, and we've had Kate Moss on, and also Claire Alexander, who said that that was the year that, because there were no women on the shortlist that year, that was the kind of impetus that led them to go on to set up the Women's Prize and things like that. Were you aware of that? Was that a controversy? Was it being debated in the press and things at the time, or was it more something that came to the fore afterwards?
I met Kate Moss many years later. In fact, quite recently, and she said to me, somewhat accusingly, "It was your Booker Prize that made us set up the Women's Prize," and I remember being thinking, well, it's not my fault. I just won it. I didn't make the choices. So you can't hold me personally responsible for that in any way. But yes, I think that was something that was something on the edge of the many controversies that year, because that was also the year that one of the judges resigned because he said there weren't enough novels of ideas in the list, the most preposterous remark to make. So there were many bits and pieces of controversy, alongside the fact that there was this young black guy who was the first black person to win the Booker. So I had enough of controversies and noise and stuff going around that I had to deal with. So I only became aware of that much later. And I agree with them. But, sometimes judging is a very strange process. And there might be years when there'll be a short list of just women, when it's just six women produce the best books of the year. It's if that's how it falls that year, that's how it falls. We have to, with the judging process, because I'm on the board of the Booker Prize, with the judging, or at least I was, till I had to leave recently because I have a novel coming out this year. But the judging process has to be as rigorous, and it has to go where it goes. If only short books that year are the best books that year, you don't throw in a long book just because you want to get some long books in there. You don't. Excellence is excellence. You just follow where the rigor leads you. And whether it did that year or not, I don't know, but that's what the judges felt. If the Women's Prize came out of that, I think that's a great thing. I think that's a most wonderful thing, because that's also been a tremendous regeneration in novels by women. That's been given us some extraordinary discoveries that might not have come to the Booker Prize. So that was a great addition.
Agreed. And you were at the time the youngest winner of the Booker Prize. I think you've now been pipped by Eleanor Catton. And as you mentioned, there was a lot made of the fact you were the first black author. And you said that you kind of didn't understand the fuss about that. And on some level, it's almost insulting, because it seemed to be this tone of surprise that a black author could win it. Tell us about that kind of experience of the reaction, and then also the kind of positive things that came from winning the Booker Prize.
Yes, and I understand that the first is always it's the nature of journalism. Journalism is interested in firsts, not seconds and thirds. So first black writer, yes, I get it. I was also really young. I didn't think I was so young back then, to be honest. I was surprised that fuss was made about the fact that I was young. There's always been that fuss. I went to secondary school when I was about 8, 9. I mean, it's yeah. There were many negative and many positive things. That I think a big moment like that is bound to create so many waves and counter waves and reactions and counter reactions and backlashes, and all happening at the same time, and you're in the midst of it, trying to make sense of it. All you did was write a book. What's all this? But the incredible thing was exactly all those waves and counter waves. It was quite tremendous. That a novel that you spent all that time writing in solitude and on the verges of, I mean, I have to say, every day that I wrote The Famished Road, I really thought that when the book was published, I I'll be stoned out of town. People will say you're crazy and something's wrong with you, and how can you be thinking things like this, and how can you be writing stuff like this? Every day I had to wrestle with the issue of sanity and acceptance, and can I get away with this, and will people, every day, and also dealing with a tremendous literary tradition that I was, I really do believe in the T.S. Eliot thing, that you have to be aware of the whole tradition in order to do your work and create something new. You just have to be. So this huge burden of a double tradition of Africa and the West, all had to go into this book and be alchemized in it. And then suddenly there was this moment that was extraordinary. That something that one wrote in that solitude could suddenly reach so many people. I mean, before the book, there's a lot of people loved it, but a lot of people were puzzled. And the prize gave people the freedom, the permission, if you like, to just read it, to read it on its own terms, to read it on its own aesthetic terms. People didn't get the aesthetics before the book. After the book, they saw those sentences. They saw that those sentences were crafted and shaped, and that they had their, the art became visible. And it's very, very strange how lazy we are, in a sense, that we need someone to say to us, "This is good," before we see that it is good. So that remains, and the fact that it immediately translated into so many languages opened up the world to me, expanded my own personal civilization. Yeah, yeah, it's yeah, it's one of the great experiences of a lifetime. So whatever negatives there was, obliterated by the beauty of it.
Just expanding on your point there, the kind of criticism that's sometimes raised your work is that it's impenetrable, that it's difficult to know what's going on and things like that. What would be your response to people who do find it very hard to kind of make sense of the narratives you're putting together?
Oh, I say in some cases it's just sheer personal laziness. In some cases it's cultural laziness. In some cases it's just an unwillingness to surrender to something new. I honestly say every time that I don't get what the big deal is about. Many of the queues when I was after the book, I sometimes had these wonderful long queues. On one of the queues somewhere in Devon, this kid who was 8 years old stepped in front of me and wanted me to sign her book. I says, "Oh, is this for your dad or your mom?" And she says, "No, it's for me." I says, "Oh, for you. Oh, you're going to read it?" No, she said she's read it. And she loved it. But how old are you? She said she was 8. 8, and you've already read it. And I just put her to one side, and I wanted her to be there, so that for critics, when they say how difficult it is to read, so I could point to this 8-year-old English kid who could read it without any difficulty. And there's the other story of the lovely woman who bought a copy and was flying to the States, and she was reading the family story in the airport, and she got so engrossed in it, she missed her flight. She sent me a letter about it years later, playfully asking me to refund. So I think it's a case of people grow up with one kind of writing. There's a way in which people, and I get that. There's a beginning, middle, end. There's a character plot. There's a way in which we grow up and expect the novel to be. And even many writers to this day speak of the novel as one kind of thing, one kind of beginning, middle, end, plot, character. The classical novel as they grew up, they grew up with. They allow for deviations in Joyce and Virginia Woolf, but that's about it. Maybe might tolerate Marquez because it's become world famous and won the Nobel Prize. And that's it. And I call that a kind of literary laziness, and also a laziness of the heart in many ways, because the tradition is there, we inherit, and the tradition is in many ways an illusion. The realist novel that we inherited from people like Jane Austen is actually very short in comparison to the length of time of the novel that goes all the way back to Don Quixote and goes all the way back to those early Roman novels. It's a very short period of time. So we're making into a classical tradition something that's a very small part of the history of the novel. The novel is called a novel, which is new. It was new at the time. And it should remain new. It's a form for the investigation of the human spirit to tell stories about the human spirit in new ways that enables us to encounter the human condition in more truthful, more mysterious, and more fascinating ways. If you can get someone from one page to another, from the beginning of a book to an end of a book, I don't think it really matters how you do it. So it is, for me, a form for the constant investigation of storytelling. There isn't just one way to tell a story. There cannot be just one way to tell a story about the human condition, because we're all incredibly different. Our experiences are different. Our cultural experiences are different. So this is not a plea for a wider literary aesthetic. It's just a plea for getting out of our literary cultural silos and investigating new ways of, and being receptive to new ways of telling stories. It's a battle I constantly fight in England and in America, where the idea that the novel can only be one kind of thing is so embedded in our minds. I give people challenges. I say to them, can you tell this story in the manner of Jane Austen? You can't. There's some stories that cannot be told. They simply cannot be told in the so-called traditional way. You need a new way to tell them. And our job is to do that, to widen the human spirit, to widen our response to this magnificent thing, this magnificent and immeasurable and untrammeled thing that we call life. Life doesn't come as a novel, as a traditional novel. It doesn't come as a beginning, middle, and end. It comes with surprises. It comes with ellipses. It comes with half expressed things. It comes with miniature revelations that unfold years and years later. Yeah, anyway, you just got me onto one of my favorite subjects, which is the widening of human possibility through the literary art.
Well, it's a rich topic. Your point about there not being one way to tell a story takes me on to my next question, which was your rewriting of your novel Starbook as The Last Gift of the Master Artists. Why did you want to take on that project?
Oh, Rachel, what a question. Yes, Starbook took me about 5 years to write and was very difficult to write as well. I was trying to deal with a number of complex things, the presence of art and the presence of art as part of the consciousness of Africa. I wanted to deal with the effect of the slave trade. There was so much I wanted to deal with, and the theme that I chose, there was a fulcrum of the whole novel was. I became fascinated by the before moments. A huge moment happens to us. How much of that huge thing was felt before it happened? Because to understand the thing itself, we need to understand what led to it. We need to understand what gave rise to it, what the mentality was that fed into it. We're talking about Brexit now, for example, after the event, but to look at the mentality before, the tropes, the arguments, the conditions on the ground, the unseen things that we didn't pay attention to before it happened, I think much more fruitful. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at the moment before the slave trade, before the first slave trade actually happened to the African continent, and its secret reverberations. So that before moment was I need to find a way to write the before moment. That too needed a tone. So it had to be a tone that was a before but has an implication of an after. And I wrote Starbook with a tremendous amount of passion, and I thought I'd done what I wanted to do. All the material was there, everything was there. Years later, I think I was reading a passage out to my daughter. I was just reading out something, and it just suddenly struck me that I'd done everything except the tone. And the tone is the hardest thing to find. I always say it's the last thing we discover in our works. We always get the material. We can tell the story. We can get the dialogue with the plot, all of that. We can do all of that. But the tone, sometimes we forget that altogether because we think when it's central like this, if you don't have the tone, then you've not freighted the work. You've not achieved the complete alchemy. And so I set myself the arduous and thankless job of trying to do that. 7 years it took me. No, yeah. Was it worth it? Nobody else appreciated it. Let me just say that right now. Nobody else appreciated it. People who have read both books sometimes say, I can't see the difference. I'm saying, well, yeah, read it aloud, sentence by sentence. You will see the difference. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I believe to get one thing right is much more important than to get 20 things half right, even if they're great.
With a couple of other writers of West African heritage that we've had on the show, René Edo-Lodge and Aminata Forna, we had very interesting conversations with them about their readerships in Africa itself and to what extent they feel they have a reading public there as opposed to in Europe or in the United States or elsewhere. And for yourself, how has that worked out? Are your books widely read and available in Nigeria and elsewhere on the continent?
I could give you an easy yes and we move on, but that wouldn't be completely correct. There's a relationship between reading and publishing. Where most countries have to import books, and there's an import license, and there's taxation, and then translation of those books into local currencies, it can become very prohibitive. Many of our books, to buy them, to buy a book of mine in Nigeria, even in paperback, you could feed your family for a week, on what it takes to buy a cheap paperback. By the time it's been translated into the naira, that's really prohibitive. That means that only certain kinds of people can read your book, and the ordinary folks, the folks in the street, many of the people that I kind of write about, won't be able to read it because they won't be able to afford it. It's only recently that it's slowly becoming a kind of a viable publishing industry in Africa, and that's one of the first things to talk about reading. That's the first thing we have to have: local publishing, a publishing that is affordable, that's able to reach people. Until you have that, you don't have an education in taste. Until you have an education in taste, you have people actually reading certain kinds of books and not being able to understand other kinds of books. You need a tradition of reading. A lot of reading in places like Nigeria. A lot of people still read kind of like those cheap romance novels. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't want to disrespect anybody. Or certain kinds of thrillers. And then they come upon novels that have a faint literary element, and they're bewildered by it. So there's a lot of work to do. So the answer to that question is yes. I have a good readership in Nigeria and South Africa and different parts of Africa, and the books are taught at schools and universities and stuff. But I'm deeply dissatisfied because we don't have as yet a great publishing industry that's able to therefore educate people over a period of time in the rich, complex tastes and tradition of reading. You don't go from reading a cheap romance to Ulysses overnight. It's not possible. It's just simply not possible.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so as a final question from me, it's a rule of the show that we ask guests about money, and it's a theme that we've obviously touched on in regards to the early stages of your career. But how has the money side of a writing career worked for you as it's developed?
Yeah, money and writing are intrinsically linked. Money was difficult at first, as you heard from the homeless period. Writing short stories, it's just, I see why many good short story writers in their early careers they write short stories and then they don't. They just write novels after that, and it's a real shame because we lose great short story writers. I'm a short story writer as well. I wish I could write more, publish more. They're hard to publish. There's not much money in it, so you end up having to write novels. I decided from the very beginning I was going to earn my living as a writer. Not from any mulishness, but because I just always felt if you're gonna do something, you do it. And through thick or thin, it's what I've done. I have not taught. I did a teaching stint for a month, and I could see that it was antithetical to my writing spirit. I want to be able to wake up the first thing in the morning and to be chewing over a character or a plot turn or a sentence. That's what I want to do. I don't want to be getting up and thinking, oh, I've got to set all these questions to these wonderful students. It's some people are made for that. I'm not. I've chosen this difficult, thankless road of writing for a living, and then you're a family man as well. It's very tough, but extraordinarily rewarding. After the Booker was a great help, but I must say that the Booker is not a permanent help because it kind of tails off. Next year there's another winner. The year after that there's another winner. There's a lot of winners to make a fuss of, and you get farther and farther back in the queue as it should be, and then you're back to struggling like any other writer. So it's up and down. My accountants, when they look at my annual returns, they always say, "My God, Ben, you're living a roller coaster life." I say, "Yeah, some years terrible, some years good." And what's my consolation? I think back on the great Scott Fitzgerald, last year of his life. Income from his books, $39.11. $39.11. This is the man who wrote The Great Gatsby and 10 Days a Night. Yeah, I'm doing fairly all right.
We very much appreciate your candor on that, poor Fitzgerald. As a final question from me, you've commented very thoughtfully elsewhere about whether you feel you're a kind of insider or an outsider, particularly in the sort of British literary world. I wonder how you feel about that, how you feel now compared to, say, in the 90s and the immediate post-Booker aftermath, and given all of the big discussion in the culture about race and racism in the past 10 years, what has the role of that been, do you think?
Yes, outsider, insider. I mean, it's taken me all these years, deep into the story of life, to actually get to understand and see that, cultures have their walls, cultures have their establishments, they have their towers. It's absolutely inevitable. I didn't get that when I was younger. I just thought the walls and the towers and the gates, they shouldn't be there. But I understand why cultures have them. There are all sorts of complicated reasons. I'm not saying it shouldn't be there. I think it should be widened. That's what I believe. But it's very, very, very hard to get them to be widened. And I thought for a long time that my difficulty would be an insider, outsider, establishment, not establishment, all of that stuff was just purely race. Till recently, I read an interview with Tracy Emin, who was just been made a dame at the time, saying that the artistic establishment is only just accepting her, turning 60, and I thought to myself, okay, so it's not just you. This is just probably the way it is. So I still feel outsider, insider. I still feel both. People thought winning the Booker Prize would make you an establishment person. It doesn't do it automatically. That's a complete illusion. And anyway, does one really want to be part of the establishment? I am not so sure that it's actually healthy for the inquiring, ever driven mind of an artist. I think the artist ought to feel and ought to be an outsider. There's something about that condition. Even if you're an insider, fix it so that you're an outsider, because there's something about that condition that makes reality luminous. You see things with extraordinary clarity because of the rawness of the wind on the outside. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I think for the purposes of art, for the purposes of this constant, difficult quest that I have for certain things I want to achieve in my writing, I think the coziness of being an insider might just destroy that. So I'm going to stay outside for as long as I possibly damn well can, because the work is much more important.
Well, that's the fitting note to end on. Thank you so much, Ben, for your time and for a really enjoyable conversation, and wishing you the very best with Madame Sosostris and all your other projects going forward.
Thank you. It's been a lovely conversation.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Ben Okri. His website is benokri.co.uk, and Madame Sosostris and the Festival for the Broken-Hearted is published by Head of Zeus.
A notice for supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
Our central offer for those who support the show is a sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends of Always Take Notes. Now greatly expanded, the package runs to more than 100 pages.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document. So if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address so no one is breaking confidences by contributing.
Before we wrap up, we have another Patreon to thank. Amir Mizrok is a former journalist, now a comms advisor, writer and podcaster. He has 2 podcasts, one of which is entirely AI generated, based on one of his creative writing projects. Amir lives in Israel, but he works with startups and journalists from around the world. Thank you so much for your support, Amir. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Ben?
I was trying to work out how many Booker Prize winners we've had now, and I think it's 5. I might be wrong, but I think it is fascinating. I think always to hear what that experience is like of winning what I suppose is still in Britain the biggest fiction prize and the impact that it has on a career. I thought it was very interesting how he talked about years and years later running into Kate Moss, who obviously we've heard about how the 1991 Booker was also the point of departure for the Women's Prize and all of that. And the point that he made that, I was in the centre of this, but I was in no way responsible for that all-male shortlist and stuff, which I thought was a fair point, actually. I think it's interesting, this idea of how the kind of impenetrability question, which we did push, and I thought he gave some thoughtful responses to that. But again, I think basically, for me, the kind of fascinating takeaway with these big prize winners is what that experience is like. And in some of the kind of challenges and complexities they bring, as well as the amazing life-changing opportunities. What about for you, Rachel?
Absolutely. I think the thing that struck me while listening to Ben talk was just how critical he was of his early work, which, and the burning of the 95 poems, I thought would be a great title for a memoir. Which that trait is very useful for a writer to some extent. People don't improve or assess the weaknesses in their work unless they are critical of it. At the same time, it can probably be a little bit debilitating if you struggle to see any merit in what you're doing. So interesting that he managed to kind of push through that or use that to his benefit. But yes, that was the thing that struck me. And what have you been up to and what have you been consuming, Simon?
I've been doing jury service last week and this week, which it's interesting. I think it's very difficult if you're self-employed. I can understand that there's sort of social justification for it, and I think actually as an idea for how to make decisions in trials, it's not a bad one, but it's incredibly disruptive to my work, and it's also the fact that your time is used extremely inefficiently. So yeah, I found that really quite a difficult and frustrating experience, actually, in many ways. Been trying to do what I can around the edges, but it's difficult. I have been doing some stuff for the next version of my book, and I've got a magazine draft, and I have planning for this travel for another story. And it was actually interesting talking to other jurors, because I was sort of sitting in this room where I've been kept waiting, working away, and they're like, well, what are you doing? And I was like, well, my job. So that I found quite vexed, actually. In terms of cultural stuff, I'm reading a French book from the 1930s. This is again for my book project, about a man called Leon Zwingelstein, who traversed the Alps entirely alone on skis in 1933. So again, he's unknown in Britain, but kind of a fascinating figure. And then in terms of reading, I did my usual thing of trying to read a couple of big magazine pieces at the weekend. So I read this big piece in the New York Times magazine about the possible threats to New York Times versus Sullivan, which is this court case that really underpins a lot of press freedom in the US. And I read a Nathan Heller story in the New Yorker about the kind of ructions at Harvard. Anyway, Rachel, what about you? What have you been up to and what have you been consuming?
Sounds like you've just been dusting about, Simon. You've been nothing. I have recently returned from New York, which I was doing a couple of interviews out there, which I will talk about in due course when the pieces emerge. And just kind of plugging on with various things. I'm doing a piece about Guinness and why everyone's going on about it these days. And I recently read a really interesting history of abortion. And I've been watching a Northern Irish comedy on BBC iPlayer called Fun Boys, which was by the producer. It's written by the producer of This Country. So if you like that kind of offbeat, and this is slightly surreal as well, type of comedy, then maybe you should check it out.
It's excellent TV recommendations. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Ervin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.